Welcome back, everybody. As we march inexorably on through the history of philosophy, our next talk is by Denis Robichaud, who is the John and Patrice Kelly of Associate Professor in the program of Liberal Studies. And he will be, the title of his talk is Our Being is Cognizing God, Plotinus, Iamblichus and Ficino on Intellect and Unity.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Can you hear me fine? Is the microphone picking this up correctly? Yeah. Thank you all for attending a talk on a topic that might not be so obvious. As I was talking to Gretchen Redem-Schill, she said it's not every day that you hear a talk on Iamblichus, and Lloyd Gerson said something similar. And it's not every day that you hear a talk on Iamblichus filtered through Ficino. So there's a reason for this, and we can maybe address this in the question. So the talk that I'm giving today is on three figures in what I'm calling the long history of Platonism, from the death of Plotinus to the death of Ficino. Plotinus we had a wonderful introduction to yesterday by Lloyd Gerson. Ficino and Iamblichus, I'll try to say something as I go along to maybe give you a little bit of context. I won't assume that you know already too much about him. I will just say that, well, let's just begin then. These are some of the other figures who will be joining us today. So Plotinus was very much aware that he was revising Parmenides' insight that thinking and being are identical, writing, I quote, that Parmenides previously touched on this doctrine, the doctrine of Plato's doctrine, to the extent that he identified being and intellect. That is, he did not place being among sensibles, saying, for thinking and being are identical. More recent proponents, and even critics of Platonism alike, have formulated a version of the proposition that to be is to be intelligible as the foundation of Platonism. And I could have started with Lloyd Gerson's talk yesterday, but I wrote this with Etienne Gilson, a household name perhaps here at Notre Dame. Take what he says, for example. If being and intelligibility can be strictly equated, the reason for it is precisely that being has first been equated with self-identity. Now, self-identity is the proper object of conceptual knowledge. To know that there is gold in a certain place is to know that what is to be found there is gold. If what is there is not gold, then there is no gold in that place. To equate reality and identity is merely to make reality be what it ought to be in order to be exhaustively intelligible to human understanding. So Gilson will eventually critique this Platonic principle, but that's irrelevant for my purpose. I quote him just to show a kind of a case study of how we can formulate it. In Gilson's formulation, it has two stages. What is proper to being, according to Plato, is self-identity. That is, for something to be is for it to be what it is. Plato expresses this principle of self-identity, or monoides, in the Phaedo, as Gilson formulates it as well, too. So second, Gilson holds that the self-identity is also proper to knowledge. That is, for something to be known is for it to be known as what it is. But the example that he puts forward, knowing that what I find in a particular place is gold, involves limited conditions and an empirical judgment of a particular being. Have the conditions of the Platonic principle changed as it is formulated by Marsilio Ficino in the title of my talk? Our being is cognizing God. For it is no longer thinking that is identical with being tout court, but our thinking that is identical to our being. Moreover, the thinking that is our being is of a specific kind of thinking, we could say, a specific thought, God. And Ficino would presumably not say that our being is cognizing gold, for example. So I wish to begin with two Platonic assumptions, followed by a question. The first assumption, if thinking is identical to being, Platonists hold that the relationship of self-identicality between thinking and being is convertible. Namely, one could express the principle, thinking is identical to being as being is identical to thinking. And it's for this reason that Platonists following Plotinus, for example, argue that being first occurs, in the sense of ontological priority, at the level of the first intellect, the divine intellect, or nous. This isn't too far from Aristotle's position in Metaphysics Lambda. So a second assumption that I want to raise is if thinking is identical to being, Platonists hold that it is reasonable to assume that my thinking is identical to my being. Now here's a question. Is the relationship between a particular instance of thinking and a particular being convertible? Although I'm certain that some might find it objectionable, many Platonists would not be troubled to state that if my thinking is identical to my being, so too is my being identical to my thinking. We can imagine, however, someone interjecting that this might hold for a particular kind of being, right, a thinking being, but not for non-thinking beings. And I'm going to skip over any considerations about the intellectual life of plants, and consider that the being I'm talking about is a thinking being. But this condition is once again about thinking tout court, not about thinking a particular thought. Do the conditions change if I qualify my thinking as thinking about a particular thought, gold or God? One can suppose that it is hypothetically possible for someone to have never thought of gold, and so it would seem absurd to conclude that our being is identical to thinking about gold. However, for Ficino, the conditions are different when thinking about gold and God. He will argue that our being is identical to thinking about God, but one might object our being cannot be to cognize God, because this would mean that we always cognize God, and this is clearly wrong, either because we only sometimes think about God, or because it is, again, hypothetically possible for someone to exist who has never entertained even the notion of God, a newborn baby, for example, or an isolated person who's never heard of a notion of God from anyone else. Against this objection, Ficino will differentiate thinking about God and being aware or conscious that one is thinking about God, so that even if we are not conscious of our thinking, we're always thinking about God, in an analogous way to how my lungs are continually expanding and contracting, even when I'm not conscious of the fact that I'm breathing. Ficino arrives at these points, at this conclusion, by arguments by Plotinus and Iamblichus, both of whom he believes agree that our being is to think about God. Now, students of Plotinus in the audience might suspect that Ficino's notion of being is cognizing God is drawing from Plotinus's notion of the undescended soul or intellect, and you'd be correct if you're thinking in these terms. And here's a classic example of how Plotinus phrases it. And so distinguishing how the highest part of ourselves, or true selves, or intellect, is not fully descended from the intelligible world. And as he says, however, if that part which is in the sensible world becomes dominant, or rather, if it is dominated and subjected to disturbance, it does not permit there to be self-awareness in us of that of which the upper part of the soul is in contemplation. For that which is the true object, for that which is the object of intellection, by the upper part only impinges on us when, in its descent, it reaches our self-awareness. So what Plotinus designates as the understanding part of the soul is mind or intellect, in essence that is identical to its activity in thinking. And because its intellectual essence is eternal, its thinking is active. But keen students of Platonism will now also realize that the doctrine of the undescended intellect is precisely the thesis that Iamblichus criticizes in Plotinus. So I just have, as a brief introduction to Iamblichus, I'll give you a quick sketch of some key points of his metaphysics. One, continuing our conversation with Lloyd Gerson yesterday, there are internal relations in his metaphysics. He'll say that selves are differentiated, but not separated into parts. If you think of parts of the soul, for example. And to make his case, Iamblichus differentiates the parts of the soul, but the parts are present throughout the whole of the substance without ontological separation. He'll say that the soul is henoides, unified, or monoides, singular, and it's kathauto, right? Thus, each soul, for example, has what he thinks to be a unification governing it. So, external relations, there are different souls. Ourselves are differentiated and separated according to the substance, to their substance from a higher and lower criteria, is how he thinks of it primarily. So the differentiation is one of differentiation of a hierarchy. In order to do this, there are intra-relations between different essences. He'll say the whole of existence too, he'll say, is henoides and monoides. So it is singular and unified. And it is therefore governed by a synthesis of these two prior principles, that separate substances remain connected hierarchically in a taxis, in a unity that is vertical. And the word that he's going to use, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, is sunoparxis. So finally, applied to the soul, this means that the essence of the soul exists as this unified singular thing in a particular place in the hierarchical series as a mean term. It's a key concept for Iamblichus between the indivisible and the divisible, the incorporeal and the corporeal. Its powers and activities are present in the substance as a whole. And as for its intellect, the majority understanding of his metaphysics is that it is completely descended, as we would usually phrase it. I'm happy to say more about this in the question and answering. Plotinus' doctrine of the undescended intellect has been characterized by some as a radical deviation or even, I quote, a heresy in the long history of Platonism, a heresy that Blumenthal and Clark argue Iamblichus first defeated. I think this is not the best way to conceive of the history of philosophy, but it is part of the literature on the question. If Ficino were to repair the rift between Plotinus and Iamblichus, it would not be inconsequential to the history of philosophy. How he arrives at this conclusion will be an important part of my talk today, and I'm not going to commit myself to his particular defense of his position. I'll leave it to you to judge whether he gets Plotinus and Iamblichus right. The material that I wish to discuss is found in Book 12 of Ficino's Platonic Theology, a large 18-volume work that he finished by 1474 that shares a title with another famous work by Proclus. And I'll divide the remainder of my talk into two parts. The first will examine sources and evidence for the topic, and then I'll analyze some philosophical issues that emerge from Book 12 of Ficino's Platonic Theology. The most important section comes from Book 4, where Ficino says, the higher countenance of our soul is called by the Platonists an imitation of the divine countenance, vultus, or face even. Plotinus, Theodore of Asine, and Iamblichus go so far as to claim that the mind of man, which is not human but divine, lives in the intelligible world and operates unceasingly through the unceasing contemplation of ideas. Two main reasons led Plotinus, Theodore, and Iamblichus to this conclusion. I'll say more about the reasons in a moment. I want to talk about Ficino's sources first. So Ficino attributes this position to three philosophers. Theodore of Asine is both the least and the most interesting in the list. He's the least interesting to Ficino, who in fact only mentions him on 3 other occasions in his writings, because Ficino knows so little about him. And today we actually don't know a lot more than what Ficino knows about Theodore. He's a Greek philosopher who was a disciple of Porphyry and Iamblichus, but was also devoted to the teachings of Plotinus' student Amelius, which led him into philosophical disagreements with Iamblichus. This disagreement apparently became so heated that a generation later, the Emperor Julian, writing when he was waging a military campaign in Gaul, wrote back to a philosopher Priscus, saying, don't be tempted by the disciples of Theodore in thinking that Iamblichus is out for honor. He's really ho theos, truly a divine man. And he says, oh, the first who can truly be called that after Plato and Pythagoras. But there was apparently a rift then in the generation after Iamblichus between their positions, and I think that has to do over the question of the intellect. So in any case, for our purposes, the fact that Ficino mentions Theodore in the company of Plotinus and Iamblichus on the question of the undescended intellect is interesting, since it tells us which source Ficino was reading while analyzing the question of the undescended intellect in the Platonic theology. There is a small dossier of text that suggests the reasons and causes for the disagreement between Iamblichus and Plotinus, and Theodore and Iamblichus, and they all have to do with Plotinus' undescended intellect. But the key piece of evidence, which I'll call today Exhibit A in the case of Iamblichus versus Plotinus, appears in Proclus' commentary on the Timaeus, talking about the descent of the soul into matter. I'm not going to read the passage. We can focus on the arguments if you want in the Q&A, but I'll just say there are 3 primary arguments. One has to do with the question of prohierasis, another one happiness, and then finally about the correct interpretation of the Phaedrus. I want to make 2 remarks, though, about the passage. First, a philological comment to prove that Ficino read this, and a second, a philosophical comment on the content of what Proclus reports. First, a little philology. In his edition of the Platonic Theology, Michael Allen writes that Ficino couldn't have known the passage because his Greek manuscript of Proclus's Timaeus in the Ricardiana ends before the passage occurs. And it's true, I would say, that Ficino's primary manuscript of the Proclus comment to the Timaeus does end before this passage, based off an article by Paolo Megna that suggests that he also read the manuscript in the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana of Proclus and Timaeus. I went and checked the passage, and lo and behold, you've got Ficino's marginal markings on the side bracketing off the specific passage as important. And you can trust me, having looked at a lot of manuscripts, that this is Ficino's hand, and if you don't trust me, here it is again in the same kind of bracketing tool in the manuscript in the Ricardiana. So, the second point that I want to raise is that I mentioned, don't want to be bothered too much in the details of the argument for now, but it's sufficient for us to say that according to Proclus, A, Plotinus and Theodore want to preserve in us an element that is impassible and always enjoying intellection, and B, I quote, the divine Iamblichus is quite correct, therefore, in attacking those who hold this position. Now, I've said that it might not be common to hear a talk on Iamblichus. There's actually a lot of literature on this question, beginning at first with E.R. Dodds, who has a note on this in 1933, but ever since then, there have been dozens and dozens of studies that have pointed to this particular passage in Proclus's Timaeus to show the disagreement. It has served, as I claim, as Exhibit A in the case of Iamblichus versus Plotinus. Most, but not all, who have examined the passage have concluded that it is evidence of irreconcilable philosophical disagreement between the two parties, represented on the one hand by Plotinus and Theodore, who argue for the undescended intellect, and on the other by Iamblichus, who argues against the undescended intellect, and who corrects the course for all subsequent later Platonists, who thereafter follow his path, and arguing that individual souls, their mind included, completely descend into bodies. I'll call this the majority interpretation, and it should be clear to you that Ficino seems to be in the minority. The first long and systematic study, and hence I would say the most influential piece on the question, is Carlos Steele's 1978 book, The Changing Self. According to Steele, Iamblichus's understanding of the soul and intellect was not just a major corrective in the Plotinian deviation. He was perhaps the first philosopher to propose not only that an individual soul and intellect can alter its powers and activities, but that it can undergo a complete substantial transformation. Iamblichus, according to Steele, brings new meaning and existential meaning to the question to change your mind. The claim that the mind can change substantially while maintaining its self-identity might itself be a challenge to the Platonic principle of self-identity with which we began, and we can maybe address this later. Steele, like everyone else, has studied the case of this particular passage of Exhibit A that I'm calling it, and it's taken to be a fragmentary piece of direct evidence demonstrating Iamblichus specifically critiquing Plotinus and Theodore on the undescended intellect. There is, however, another irreconcilable testimonium found in Simplicius's commentary on Aristotle's categories that directly contradicts this interpretation. While discussing correlative terms of necessity, the ta prostai in the categories, that is, terms that are thought to come into existence simultaneously, since the existence of one term necessitates that of the other, like half and double, those are the examples that Aristotle gives. Aristotle remarked in his categories that the object of knowledge would appear to exist before knowledge itself, for it is usually the case that we acquire knowledge of objects already existing. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to find a branch of knowledge, the beginning of the existence of which was contemporaneous with that of its object. And Simplicius remarks, and I'm just going to read the bottom passage, the immaterial intelligible objects exist simultaneously with the science, which is always an act. Either there is always in us such a science which always remains above, as Plotinus and Iamblichus think, hos Plotino kai Iamblicho docai, or such a science exists in the intellect and the act, if one would still call this intellection science. So I was actually reading Steele's translation. This is my own up on the board. The simultaneous coexistence of knowledge and its object qua correlative term could only be possible in two cases, Simplicius concludes. Either one, if our intellect is undescended and remains always in act with the divine intellect, or two, only if the activity of the only in the activity of the divine intellect itself. However, that Simplicius attributes the former doctrine to both Plotinus and Iamblichus flies in the face of the majority interpretation of Exhibit A. Steele, therefore, proposes an ingenious solution to solve the contradiction by suggesting to amend the passage according to a principle that I would characterize as an usus philosophandi, so that instead of reading hos Plotino kai Iamblicho docai, one should read hos Plotino kata Iamblikon docai. The passage in Simplicius would then no longer serve as evidence that Iamblichus agreed with Plotinus on the undescended intellect, but would merely record Iamblichus's own reporting of Plotinus's position. However ingenious this emendation might be, it doesn't seem too philologically plausible, as Steele also suggests when he makes it. And the problem remains that there's other evidence ignored by Steele in his book that seems to challenge, if not outright contradict, the majority interpretation of Exhibit A. This was brought forward by Vandenberg in 1997, and he seems to have been the first to bring forward this evidence. For example, in a section of his lecture notes on Plato's Phaedo, devoted to eschatology and the fate of souls, Damascus reports that Iamblichus believes that souls, or at least certain souls, are permanently in the state of perfection and have never broken their connection to the higher intelligible realm. In an earlier section of the same lecture that Vandenberg doesn't mention, Damascus once more introduces Iamblichus's opinion while discussing Plato's eschatology to argue against Iamblichus' position that it's possible for certain souls to remain forever in the intelligible realm. So after reviewing this evidence, Steele in 2006 slightly modified his original assessment when he prepared the Italian version of his book and concluded in agreement with Vandenberg that Iamblichus must have believed that the intellect of certain souls, though probably not all souls, as Plotinus believed, or certain intellects, I should say, remained undescended. Such individuals, in all likelihood holy men, the highest theurgists and philosophers like Plato and Pythagoras, should be deemed ho theos, as Iamblichus was called himself by other Platonists. So I'm certain that all of you by now have taken note that Ficino is in the minority camp in concluding that Iamblichus agrees with Plotinus and Theodore. Given the fact that Ficino's source in the passage I previously quoted from the Platonic theology is Exhibit A from Iamblichus versus Plotinus, how does Ficino argue his position? I've already proven that he knows this material, but what then of the other sources that make up the dossier? Ficino knows some texts by Simplicius and cites him along with Themistius on a couple of occasions as a good interpreter of Aristotle, but there's no clear evidence that he studied his commentary on the categories. There is, however, again, clear manuscript evidence that Ficino read Damascus's lectures on the Phaedo, and in those passages, speaking about Iamblichus's belief that there is an undescended intellect, he takes note of them in the margins there too. It's a little bit of more source criticism. But the most important source for Ficino is actually Iamblichus's De Mysteris. It's actually a source text that isn't brought into the debate by modern scholars about Iamblichus and Plotinus, but is the central piece of evidence for Ficino. It has to do with gnosis and the nature of gnosis. So this is where I will bring the rest of the talk. The passage in question is at 1:3, and I propose to read it in full because it's important for the argument I'm going to make. It's a little long, so bear with me. Well then, you, Porphyry, first acknowledge that to concede that the gods exist, but speaking in this way is not correct. For a natural cognition of the gods coexists with our very being, or we might say our substance, sunuparke gar hemon autete ousia, and is superior to every judgment and intentional choice, and exists prior to reason and demonstration, and is united from its principle to its own cause, and is interwoven with the soul's substantial desire for the good. But if I were to speak truly, it is not a cognition of divinity, but a contact with divinity, it says sunafe. For cognition is separated in a certain way through alterity, but prior to this cognition of another as another, there is a naturally automatic and indestructible interweaving of its simple form, its monoides, connecting it to the gods. One must not, therefore, assent to this cognition of divinity as though it were possible to concede or not concede, nor is it to be posited as uncertain, for it remains always in activity according to its unified form, its henoidos. Nor is it worthy to examine it as though it were its lord judging or defending it, for rather we are enveloped in it and filled by it, and for we have our self-identity, which is our true being, in cognizing the gods. And this reason is also relevant for you regarding, I quote, the higher class of divinities immediately following the gods, quoting Porphyry. I mean demons, heroes, and pure souls. For in their case too, it is always necessary to think of one defining reason for their being, or their ousia, their substance, and to resist leaning toward one side or another while comparing both of the sides, balancing reasoning, and to do away with what is indefinite and inconsistent in the fate of man. I think I'm, yeah. Where am I? Yeah, for this is foreign to the principles of reason and life, and it turns us away rather toward the lesser orders and all that pertains to the potentiality and opposition of being. But it is necessary to apprehend them as simple forms. Hence, may the natural cognition of the eternal followers of gods be like them. It's an important principle of homoiosis. Since just as they always have their being in an identical way, so too the human soul is connected to them in the same way in cognition, neither investigating by means of conjecture, opinion, syllogistics, nor at all by means of any operation beginning at a particular moment of time, all being beyond these operations, but is joined to these higher divinities by means of pure and irreproachable thoughts, which it obtained eternally from the gods. But you seem to believe that the cognition of the gods is identical to the cognition of other things, gold, for example, and to concede one part of antithetical positions, as it is customarily proposed for them in dialectical exercises. But this is in no way comparable, for the knowledge of God is completely different, separate from all logical antithesis, and does not consist in assenting now that the gods exist. Rather, the cognition of the gods always exists and is simple. Its simple form coexists, there's that word again, sunuparkusa, from eternity in the soul. Okay, so I wish to make several points here. The first, in order to explain away the potential contradictory passage in Simplicius's commentary on Aristotle's categories, Steele originally suggested a conjectural emendation to Simplicius's text, while Blumenthal dismissed it altogether, and Rist proposed a developmental account of Iamblichus's philosophy of mind, arguing that he might have first accepted Plotinus's undissident intellect before ultimately rejecting it. So these options aren't necessary if one glosses Simplicius's testimony about Iamblichus with Iamblichus's own arguments from the De Mysteris. For Simplicius proposes that Iamblichus, like Plotinus, holds that there exists a certain kind of knowledge that is correlative to its object, that is, a certain kind of knowledge that necessarily exists immediately and contemporaneously with what it knows. The only kind of knowledge that would meet this criterion would be one that coexists eternally with the knower and the known. This is what Iamblichus proposes in De Mysteris 1:3, that God exists, the cognition that God exists is coexistent with the existence of the gods. But what exactly does Iamblichus mean by coexistence, sunuparxis? A first observation is that Iamblichus is differentiating the connotations of sunuparxis from the connotations of substance or essence, of ousia. Porphyry should have understood this because he too employs the cognates of huparxis, not sunuparxis, but huparxis in a different capacity as ousia. Whereas the latter signifies the essence or substance of a being, according to Porphyry, the other is the activity of being. This gets translated, it seems, into the language of existence and essence, or one way to think about it at least. Iamblichus employs sunuparxis in a related but somewhat different manner. He too differentiates and relates it to the substance, ousia, in order to express what I'm going to call a henological presence or coexistence of substance, or substances. That is, the sunuparxis denotes how a substance is itself a unity, which we might call a state, but we might actually think more of a kind of unification, an activity necessarily coexistent with the essence's state. It is for this reason that sunuparxis is a correlative term, a coexistence, which we might want to call a co-presence. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. It's for this reason that Iamblichus claims that properly speaking, this kind of thinking is not really a thinking or cognition of divinity, but a contact, he says, sunafe. He's consistent throughout in employing these terms and to speak about the contact of forms that are monoides and henoides. This is a kind of cognition. We might call it a hypercognition or a Iamblichian cognition. And it's different from the kind of knowledge we have if we observe something and take on accidental properties, whether real, virtual, or intentional in our knowledge. It's something like a kind of monadology, whereby our simple and unified form, that is our true substance in essence, is connected to the simple and unified form of the divine. Technically speaking, it's not our nous that is engaging in the activity of knowing, but what Iamblichus calls the one of the soul. Since Iamblichus, moreover, posits that this takes place by means of similarity, it's necessary that this activity always is coexistent or co-present with the eternal divine to which it is joined. In other words, it does not, like our discursive thinking, take place at certain times, and it's not dependent on our conscious awareness of our thoughts. It's prior to our free choice, but it's always active and co-present with what we could say is up there. And if our minds are often characterized by Platonists as the highest part of our soul, Iamblichus tries to one-up them, and as others do later, and we'll speak about the one of the soul as being higher. Can we characterize it as undescended? Iamblichus does not, this is my take here, not Ficino, does not seem to want to launch our soul onto the same horizontal ontological plane as the divine intellect, but rather link up all the divine unities of our soul included into vertical chains. Still, Iamblichus's philosophy does have real metaphysical implications for the kind of contact this kind of hypercognition sets, because according to Iamblichus, it creates the existential conditions for our very beings as unities. Iamblichus is assuming the schema of essence, potentiality, and activity familiar to Aristotelians in the room in his argument. In cognizing that the divine exists, our mind does not gain a new accident, whether it is real, virtual, intentional, that knowing the gods exist. In the same way of knowing in my hand I've got this remote. This latter kind of knowledge, according to Iamblichus, happens through an external activity of our intellectual powers. This cognizing of the divine, however, isn't a knowledge through activity or a knowledge through powers, but a knowledge with kata ousian, he'll say, or per essentiam, as Ficino translates it. For this reasons, he says, we have our self-identity, which is our true being in cognizing the gods. So it is a kind of existential knowledge, is one way we can consider this. So Ficino translates this. And I should say it's not just a small class of souls that Iamblichus is talking about. He's talking about all souls, which is an important differentiation than what has been brought to fore in the debate. So Ficino translates this material, and I'm going to not work through the translation, but I'm going to bring your attention to, as he translates it, this is how it's printed on the right in 1497. This is what the manuscript looks like. And the translation originally begins as a paraphrase in the margins of his Greek manuscript. And if you look what's written in the manuscript versus what's printed, you find out that, originally there is a secundum Plotinum put in here to try to show the exegetical connection between the two. He deletes that in the printed text. We find him doing something similar in other sections, and I'm not going to go through them, but you can just detect an exegetical strategy of trying to align Plotinus and Iamblichus. I would do I'm going to skip this next section for questions of time. I would do a case study of Iamblichus's use of sunuparxis elsewhere in the De Mysteris to show how this works, and so that you don't think that I'm completely crazy in arguing that this is what's going on also in the contradictory passage in Simplicius's text. If you actually look at so Ficino, in the passage of sunuparxis, says, go look at Plotinus. Plotinus is talking in this way. And if you go look at Plotinus, Plotinus will use sunuparxis, I believe only twice. Maybe Professor Gerson can correct me. But he uses it to talk about the coexistence of intellect and being. So it is, at the level of nous, it's a horizontal correlation, and Iamblichus is taking that horizontal correlation and you could say flipping it vertically and creating a hierarchy out of it. And if you look at the Simplicius's commentary on the categories, which has the contradictory passage of what I'm calling Exhibit A, is actually a treasure trove of Iamblichian source material. And if you look, the passage that contradicts Exhibit A from the Proclus's Timaeus commentary itself is devoted again to the question of sunuparxis in particular. So I think this is at least an important term in Iamblichus that has been, as far as I know, largely neglected. So I'm going to finish by going back to Ficino's Platonic theology. Ficino gives us two reasons why Iamblichus agrees with Plotinus and Theodore of Essene. The first, he says, is that our soul's highest mind, being itself an intellectual essence, understands through its essence, per essentiam. This is Iamblichus's argument too. Ficino gives an elaboration. He says, just as fire heats through its essence or water chills, though the soul's power is inferior to the mind, it does not understand through its essence. Just as fire always heats, therefore, so mind always understands. But the object of understanding are things eternal species. In understanding, the intellect does not attach itself to the deceptive image of objects, but to understand truly, it is united with the objects themselves. So the mind is always united with the eternal species, whence it eagerly dwells in the house of eternity. That is the point of Iamblichus's remark. The being of our intellect is nothing other than understanding of powers divine, or noumena. So Michael Allen further remarks, and I'd like to, maybe I should honor his memory. He recently passed away. He did wonderful work on Ficino. And he remarks that we can't find the source text for this Iamblichian passage in the De Mysteris, or in any of Iamblichus's texts. I actually think it comes directly from 1.3 that I just mentioned, of this notion of Iamblichian cognition as a knowledge per essentiam. And insofar as it constitutes the simple being of our intellect, it is, I think, an existential state, or would be one way to characterize it. So the second argument that Ficino puts forward makes it clear that this kind of hypercognition of the divine is different from knowledge of particular beings, like gold, to continue my example. Ficino once more is following Iamblichus in arguing that the soul is a mean term connecting the mind to body. He says, as a line that simultaneously touches both the center and circumference, or as a sunlight that is united with the sun, but at the same time diffused through the air. Ficino further explains the points of connection between the middle terms and the two extremes with an argument a fortiori. And he says, the soul's lowest part, which is the power of nourishment, presides over the corporeal life. If this lowest part, which is joined to the body, is always active and acts in a way through its own being, then a fortiori, the highest power, which is the more powerful since it cleaves more closely to its source, is always active and acts in a way through its own being. It acts with regard to mind from which it immediately issues, for only mind flows from mind. Ficino then gives, I'm not going to read the whole passage, an argument why this is best understood as a touching, he says to use Iamblichus's terminology, as sunafe, and then he appeals to Plotinus and says Plotinus is very good at telling us that this is different than self-awareness or consciousness. So he's here making a distinction between this Iamblichian hypercognition and awareness of intellection, as it were, or even awareness of hypercognition, as it were. Good. So Ficino explains that Iamblichian cognition is, I would say, henological in the same way as Plotinus's model of mind is too. Each mind is a simple and unified form, monoides, henoides, which itself is unified to simple and unified forms. They have internal relations, as Lloyd Gerson was telling us yesterday. Instead of a simple vertical model to explain this unification, he puts forward a Plotinian image of how concentric circles are joined at the center. And I'm going to end with this. As the lesser spheres within the greater spheres touch with their centers, the center of the greater, so minds, which are, as it were, the lesser spheres of the intelligible world, included under the divine goodness, as under the greater sphere, and under it having revolved by way of their own centers, that is, their own unities, which are superior to the intellect, so mind, I say, links themselves to the divine unity as to the center of a universe. So while our minds might be the head of our soul, as Ficino says, our minds themselves have a head, as Ficino also says, recalling the doctrine of the one of the soul. So we have a unity, we are unified, or we are unity, we don't have a unity. So instead of speaking of an undescended intellect, it is best to speak of is it best to speak about a centered or united intellect? This is at least what Ficino seems to be proposing, to try to align Iamblichus, his hypercognition, I would say, with Plotinus, for better or worse. Thank you.